Here is something the palace does not want you to know. Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, the man stripped of his military affiliations, his royal patronages, his working royal status, his public role, and very nearly his home, has not accepted any of it. Not privately. Not in the way the institution needs him to accept it quietly, completely, with the dignified withdrawal that the palace script requires. He is fighting back. Not in court, not in public statements, not through the kind of open, documented campaign that would give the palace something concrete to respond to and shut down. He is fighting back in the way that people with the remnants of influence and the desperation of someone who has lost almost everything fight back. Through intermediaries, through private approaches, through the leveraging of relationships built over decades as the Queen's son and Britain's trade ambassador, relationships that the palace stripped of their official context but could not strip from the man himself. Sources with direct knowledge of Andrew's activities throughout 2024 describe a prince who is with a focus and a determination that his critics find equal parts impressive and alarming, conducting a quiet, persistent, multi-front campaign to restore what was taken from him. Not everything. He is not delusional enough to believe the military titles are coming back in the near term. Not the patronages. Not the public platform. But something. Enough. A foothold back inside the institution that defined his entire identity for 60 years. And the palace's response to this campaign, behind closed doors, in the conversations that never produce press releases, is not calm management. It is fury. Tonight, we go inside Andrew's secret campaign. And we explain why the palace cannot simply make him stop. If you are new here, this channel does not do speculation dressed up as analysis. We do not repeat what the tabloids say and call it commentary. What we do is go deeper, stay longer, and tell you the parts of the story that the palace's communications apparatus would very much prefer you never heard. If that is the kind of royal coverage you have been looking for, hit like, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what is coming in the next 20 minutes is the most forensic examination of Prince Andrew's secret rehabilitation campaign that any channel has attempted. You will not find this version of the story anywhere else. Now let us get into it. To understand Andrew's rehabilitation campaign, you need to understand what he had before the Epstein scandal consumed it. For over 2 decades, Prince Andrew served as the United Kingdom's special representative for international trade and investment. It was a role that suited him perfectly. He was sociable, confident, comfortable in rooms with powerful people, and he carried the one credential that no amount of money or achievement can purchase. He was the Queen's son. That credential opened doors that no trade minister, no business delegation, no diplomatic mission could access independently. Andrew travelled the world. He met presidents, prime ministers, sovereign wealth fund managers, and heads of state. He built relationships, personal, warm, sometimes inappropriately close, with some of the most powerful people in the global economy. For over 20 years, he was Britain's most well-connected royal export, a man who could pick up a telephone and reach the kind of people that most governments spend months trying to get a meeting with. When the Epstein scandal destroyed his public role in November 2019, when that BBC Newsnight interview detonated what remained of his credibility, and the palace moved with unusual speed to strip him of his working royal status, the official machine stopped. The diary was cleared. The patronages were handed back. The military affiliations were surrendered. The institutional infrastructure that had defined his public identity for 2 decades was dismantled in a matter of weeks. But here is what the palace's press releases could not dismantle. The people who had sat across from Andrew at state dinners in Beijing, in Riyadh, in Singapore, in Abu Dhabi, they did not forget him. The relationships were stripped of their official context, yes. The letterhead changed. The title became complicated to use in formal settings. But the personal connections, the phone numbers saved in devices around the world, the accumulated goodwill of 20 years of royal trade diplomacy, these things do not evaporate with a Buckingham Palace press release. And Andrew, sitting in Royal Lodge with his titles technically intact, but his purpose entirely hollowed out, has spent 2024 and into 2025 doing something the palace finds deeply troubling: using them. Sources describe Andrew maintaining active contact with figures in the international business community, particularly in regions where the British royal connection carries significant social and commercial weight, and where the nuances of the Epstein scandal are less immediately politically toxic than they are in the United Kingdom and the United States. The Gulf states, parts of Asia, business networks, where proximity to royalty is a currency that does not lose its value as quickly as it does in a British newspaper headline. Andrew is not conducting official business. He has no official role. He has no mandate from the palace, from the government, from any institution that would give his activities a legitimate framework. He is simply a prince. Making calls, having lunch, attending dinners in contexts that are private enough to avoid immediate press attention, reminding people, in person and through intermediaries, who he is, what he represents, what he could still, potentially, facilitate, and using those conversations to build the case, person by person, relationship by relationship, lunch by lunch, that he is not finished. That there is a path back. That the institution that stripped him of his public role can be persuaded or pressured or simply outlasted into finding a place for him again. The palace finds this behaviour not merely embarrassing, it finds it dangerous. And to understand why, you need to get specific about what Andrew's campaign looked like in 2024, because the details are more extraordinary than the general picture. Reports emerged throughout 2024 of Andrew maintaining contacts with figures in the Chinese business community, specifically individuals connected to Chinese state-linked investment networks. These contacts, sources suggest, were not casual. They were purposeful. Andrew was positioning himself as a potential back channel, a figure with royal credentials and long-established personal relationships who could facilitate certain kinds of business and diplomatic dialogue in ways that formal channels could not. Now, stop and absorb the significance of that for a moment. Because this is not simply a former trade ambassador keeping in touch with old contacts. This is a man who has been explicitly stripped of any official role, any institutional mandate, any government authorization, operating as a quasi-independent diplomatic actor in one of the most geopolitically sensitive bilateral relationships Britain has. and doing so, sources suggest, with a deliberate awareness that his royal identity, his blood, his surname, his position in the line of succession, however distant, gives those conversations a weight and a meaning that would not attach to a private citizen without those credentials. The palace's alarm at these reports was not simply reputational. It was strategic. Because any suggestion that a senior member of the royal family, even one stripped of his working royal status, is conducting unsanctioned quasi-diplomatic engagement with Chinese state-linked business networks lands in an extraordinarily sensitive geopolitical context. Britain's relationship with China in 2024 is delicate, contested, and actively managed at the highest levels of government. The security services take an intense interest in exactly this kind of unsanctioned contact. The Foreign Office has spent years trying to calibrate Britain's posture toward Beijing with extreme care. The idea of Andrew operating outside any official framework, accountable to nobody, driven by his own rehabilitation agenda rather than any coherent national interest, inserting himself into that landscape, was received by the palace and by Whitehall with something approaching horror. Approaches were made. Through channels. Andrew was told, in the clear, unambiguous language that the palace uses when it is genuinely alarmed rather than merely irritated, that these activities needed to stop, that they were creating problems that extended far beyond the management of his own reputation, that there were national security dimensions to what he was doing that he either had not considered or had chosen to disregard. Andrew's response, sources suggest, was to deploy his most effective remaining leverage: Royal Lodge. Now, if you have been following this channel, you will know that the property standoff at Royal Lodge is not a new story. We covered it in depth in an earlier episode. But what I want to give you tonight is the version of that standoff that the reporting has consistently undersold. Because the way Andrew's team frames the Royal Lodge situation privately is not the way it tends to get reported publicly. Publicly, the narrative is stubborn. An entitled man refusing to leave a grand house because he has always lived in grand houses and cannot conceive of a different arrangement. The tabloids have portrayed it as vanity, as denial, as the behaviour of a man who has not grasped that his time is over. That framing serves the palace's interests, and it is wrong. Sources close to Andrew's thinking describe the Royal Lodge occupation as a deliberate, calculated, negotiating position, not stubbornness, strategy. The calculation, expressed in its most direct form, is this: if you want me out of Royal Lodge without a public legal battle that generates weeks of damaging headlines about the monarchy's treatment of an elderly former duke, give me something. Not a return to the full public duties that existed before 2019. Andrew understands that is not achievable in the current climate, and he is not asking for it. But something. A path. A role, however limited, however carefully defined, however far removed from the public platform he once had, that gives him a reason to cooperate with the institutional timeline the palace has laid out for his complete withdrawal. A rehabilitation timeline. A managed, gradual return to some form of public engagement, not as a working royal, but as a private citizen with royal blood, who is permitted to represent certain interests in certain contexts. A fig leaf. An acknowledgement. something that allows him to construct a final chapter that is not simply the story of a man who lost everything and sat in a large house until he died. Andrew is using the house as a bargaining chip. And the palace, which wants him out of the house, wants him out of the business networks, wants him out of the headlines, wants him out of every conversation that is not completely under institutional control, is faced with a negotiation it did not want to be in and cannot cleanly exit. Because here is the brutal arithmetic of Andrew's position that his critics consistently fail to account for. He has nothing left to lose. Read that again. A man with nothing left to lose, sitting in a 30-room Windsor mansion, with a telephone full of international contacts and a complete indifference to institutional approval, is, in negotiating terms, the most dangerous kind of counterparty you can face. He cannot be threatened with reputational damage because the reputational damage has already been done at the maximum possible scale on global television. He cannot be threatened with the withdrawal of public affection because the public affection is already gone. He cannot be threatened with the loss of his working royal status because that was taken 3 years ago. He cannot be threatened with exile from the Windsor Estate because the only leverage the palace has over that outcome is the legal route, and the legal route creates a public spectacle that is at least as damaging to the institution as it is to Andrew. He can wait. He has demonstrated, consistently and publicly, that he can wait. He sat through the Newsnight interview fallout and waited. He sat through the civil suit settlement and waited. He sat through the public humiliation of being excluded from his own mother's Platinum Jubilee celebrations and waited. He sat through the funeral of the Queen, the one person who was always in his corner, whose protection and whose love was the invisible scaffolding beneath his entire public identity, and he waited through that grief and continued. Andrew has shown the palace, through 5 years of sustained institutional pressure, that he does not break. He bends. He retreats. He recalibrates. But he does not break. Can the palace say the same? And this is where Andrew's campaign creates a problem for William that goes beyond the property dispute and the business networking, a problem that strikes at the heart of what William is trying to build, and what Andrew's continued existence as an active, undefeated presence in the Windsor orbit threatens. William is building a monarchy. And not just any monarchy, a specific, particular, carefully constructed version of the monarchy represents a decisive break from the chaotic decade that preceded his eventual accession. His model is Anne. His commitment is institutional over personal. His message, delivered through every engagement and every carefully managed communication, is that the House of Windsor has moved on from the Sussex crisis, from the Andrew disgrace, from the years of personal drama that allowed the public and the press to see behind the carefully maintained facade. William's monarchy is clean, controlled, disciplined. It does not have open wounds. Andrew is an open wound. Every photograph of Andrew on horseback in Windsor Great Park, looking comfortable and undefeated, says to the watching public, this is not over. Every reported business lunch, every rumoured intermediary approach, every week that Royal Lodge remains occupied says something that William's monarchy cannot afford for anyone to say. The palace does not fully control its own members. The institution that stripped Andrew of his titles and his role and his public platform cannot make him leave a house, cannot stop him making phone calls, cannot prevent him from showing up in public spaces looking like a man who has decided he is not finished. For William, who needs the world to see a monarchy that is unified, purposeful, and under coherent central leadership, Andrew is the living, breathing, horse-riding embodiment of institutional incompleteness. And the options available to William are considerably more limited than his expanding authority might suggest. He cannot force Andrew out through direct personal confrontation without creating the public spectacle that both men, for different reasons, want to avoid. A public war between the king's heir and the king's brother generates the kind of coverage that drowns every positive story the palace tries to tell. It humanizes Andrew in ways the palace does not want him humanized. It makes William look vindictive. It creates sympathy for the underdog, and in a confrontation between the future king and his disgraced uncle, the optics of who is the underdog are not as simple as the palace would like. He cannot use the legal route to evict Andrew from Royal Lodge without generating exactly the damaging headlines. The palace's entire strategy is designed to avoid weeks of courtroom reporting, legal documents entering the public record, details of internal palace finances and property arrangements becoming visible in ways the institution finds deeply uncomfortable. He cannot publicly disown his uncle, an aging man with no apparent path back to meaningful public life, a man who was present at every significant moment of William's childhood, a man who served in the Falklands War when William was an infant, without generating a wave of public sympathy for Andrew that runs directly counter to the palace's preferred narrative of a man who received fair treatment and appropriate consequences. What William can do, and what sources suggest, is the current operational strategy is to apply pressure through the slow, deliberate withdrawal of every remaining institutional comfort available to Andrew. Staff costs at Royal Lodge increasingly are not covered by palace resources. Administrative support quietly reduced. Security arrangements subject to ongoing review. The ambient signals that accumulate over months and years into an environment that becomes progressively more difficult and more expensive for Andrew to maintain unilaterally. Not a dramatic, headline-generating eviction, a slow, deliberate, institutional squeeze. The same technique applied with the same cold patience that the monarchy has used to manage inconvenient members for centuries. The Windsors are, above all things, institutional survivalists. They have been doing this for longer than most modern states have existed. They know how to wait. They know how to apply pressure without fingerprints. They know how to make a situation quietly untenable without ever having to announce that they are doing so. But Andrew, who has already survived what should have been unsurvivable, who has already sat through a BBC interview that destroyed his public career and simply continued to exist, undeflected, on the other side of it, is not easily squeezed. He is, in the most specifically institutional sense, a problem without a clean solution. And William, who needs clean solutions, who is building a monarchy precisely on the foundation of clean solutions and the absence of irreducible complexity, is going to be managing this problem for longer than he wants to acknowledge. Now let us take a longer view. Because here is the most uncomfortable truth about the Andrew situation that the palace cannot say publicly and Andrew cannot afford to acknowledge privately. There is no version of Andrew's rehabilitation campaign that ends well. Not for Andrew. Not for the palace. Not for the women whose lives were damaged by the network that Andrew was embedded in, women whose ongoing pursuit of full accountability does not respect the palace's preferred public relations timelines or the Duke of York's personal narrative of redemption. Consider the two possible outcomes. If Andrew succeeds, if he leverages Royal Lodge and the business contacts and the sheer exhausting persistence of his continued presence into some form of institutional accommodation, if the palace blinks and finds some managed role, some quiet acknowledgement, some fig leaf of public rehabilitation that gives him enough of what he wants to make cooperation look more attractive than continued defiance, then the signal sent to every future royal who creates a crisis of comparable scale is this: defiance works. Hold out long enough, make the palace's position uncomfortable enough, use whatever leverage you have access to without mercy or restraint, and the institution will eventually find a way to accommodate you, because the alternative is worse. That precedent terrifies William's team in ways that are difficult to overstate. Because the Sussexes are watching. Because every difficult family member in every royal family in Europe is watching. Because the message that the monarchy's definition of your story can be successfully contested through sheer institutional intransigence is a message that the institution absolutely cannot afford to transmit and survive as the disciplined, coherent body that William needs it to be. If Andrew fails, if the institutional squeeze eventually makes Royal Lodge financially and logistically untenable, and he leaves without any accommodation, without any face-saving arrangement, without any managed narrative that gives his final chapter a shape he can live with, then he becomes something arguably more dangerous. A man with nothing, no role, no home on the Windsor Estate. No institutional connection beyond the accident of blood. No reason remaining to cooperate with anything the palace asks of him. And a man in that position, with Andrew's temperament and Andrew's contacts, and Andrew's demonstrated comfort with risk and his proven indifference to consequences, is a permanent, unpredictable, uncontrollable variable. A loose piece on a board that the palace needs desperately to control. There is no clean exit. There is only management. The long, expensive, reputationally corrosive, institutionally draining business of containing a member of the royal family who has decided, with the clarity that comes from having nothing left to protect, that the institution's version of his story is not the one he is willing to accept. And beneath all of the property disputes and the business networking and the institutional manoeuvring, beneath the headlines and the Royal Lodge standoffs and the whispered fury in palace corridors, there is a human story that the monarchy's management of the situation tends deliberately and necessarily to obscure. A man who was, by all accounts, the Queen's favourite son. Not her favourite child in the simple sense that was almost certainly Anne, who was the most like her, the most disciplined, the most devoted to duty without requiring recognition. But favourite son in the emotional sense. The one she worried about most. The one whose protection she prioritised beyond what the institution perhaps required. The one for whom she quietly maintained a space inside the royal structure long after the evidence suggested that space was becoming impossible to justify. A man who spent 60 years inside one of the most extraordinary, most demanding, most psychologically complex institutions in the world, who had access and power and global reach and the identity-defining certainty of knowing exactly who he was and exactly what he was for, Who built a life, however problematic, however morally compromised, we now understand its foundations to have been, around a role that was taken from him not gradually, not manageably, but catastrophically and completely in the space of a few weeks in November 2019. And who now sits in a 30-room house in Windsor, making calls to contacts in Beijing and Riyadh, trying to convince the world, and perhaps most importantly, trying to convince himself that there is still a chapter to be written, that the institution which defined him for 6 decades has not written the final word, that a prince of the United Kingdom, whatever else he has lost, still has the capacity to matter. The monarchy would like that chapter to be blank. Andrew is determined to fill every page. And so I want to leave you tonight with the question that this entire story ultimately reduces to. The question that sits beneath the property disputes and the lobbying campaigns and the palace fury and the geopolitical alarm. Does Prince Andrew deserve any path back to public life on any terms, in any form, however limited, however carefully defined? Is there a version of partial rehabilitation that serves justice, that serves the institution, that serves the public interest? Or has he forfeited that possibility permanently, not just institutionally, not just legally, but morally, in ways that make any accommodation not a human compromise, but a fundamental betrayal of accountability? And is his refusal to accept the palace's definition of his ending a symptom of a man who has genuinely, in 60 years of extraordinary privilege, been truly held to account for anything? A man who grew up in an institution that absorbed consequences on his behalf, managed damage on his behalf, protected him on behalf of a mother who loved him too well and too uncritically to let reality reach him. I do not have a clean answer to that question. I am not sure a clean answer exists. Write yours below. The comment section on this story will be extraordinary because it is not a simple question, and anybody who tells you it is has not thought about it hard enough. Subscribe now because topic 16 is coming. And it takes us back to California for the most forensic examination of the Sussex commercial collapse that any channel has attempted. The numbers. The deals that fell apart, the strategic miscalculations, and the question of what Harry and Meghan actually do now that the commercial dream has demonstrably failed to deliver what it promised. You will not want to miss it. And if you have made it to the end of this video, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for.